June 4th, 1927. It was a moderate summer's day when the case file was slapped on my desk. I was a private investigator at the time. I had seen a lot of cases in my day, but none had been as personal as this one. Personal was only a loosely applied term, of course. I didn't actually know the victim. But this case reflected one of the best times in my life. The Roaring Twenties. I went out to the crime scene the second I got the case. It was the murder of a certain man who had just hit that point in his career, or the point of great success. His name was Francis Reynolds. He was a renowned musician, and only just began to hit success in the jazz age. A lot of the suspects that I interviewed had a lot to say about his music.
His music really reflects the new wave of jazz, so it's called. A lot of syncopation and unique instrumentation. Trumpets and saxophones are becoming very popular.
Yeah, I've heard of him. I've heard his music, too. If you ask me, I ain't a fan of this new jazz at all. It's just harboring evil. It's just improvisational junk.
I did learn some interesting facts during these interviews, though. Did you know that jazz originated just a few years ago in the early 20s in Storyville, New Orleans? African Americans started mingling with whites in brothels and bars, and eventually they spawned their own music. It didn't take long until Storyville was shut down, for some reason. All of the African Americans were shipped off to places like Chicago and New York. If you ask me, that explains how jazz became so widespread so fast. Well, that and the radio. That darn contraption, I'll never understand it. I learned pretty quickly that these suspects were going nowhere fast. They just wouldn't stop talking about jazz music.
I think Francis had what was coming to him. It's because he tampered with jazz music. Quite frankly, I wish he hadn't have written music at all. Years from now, people are going to look back on the 20s and say, jazz was such a horrible idea. What were they thinking? The type of music is just going to be the downfall of society, I tell you.
If I wanted any real information, I was going to have to go to where Francis spent most of his time, as did everyone else, the local speakeasy. It's kind of funny. A few years ago, you'd look at the idea of a speakeasy and think, oh, that's preposterous, that'll never happen. Well, it has. Some call it a filthy cesspool of flagrant women and filthy music. As for me, I call it home. Speakeasy is the only place you'll find a good drink around here. Sure, they're run by neighborhood mobsters, but if you don't mess with the kingpin, he won't mess with you. So that was my next destination. I didn't know where to begin. It could have been the smoke that filled the air, but I could hardly tell the difference between any of the locals. All of them flapper girls looked the same to me. Flappers. An interesting bunch. They seemed to have popped up out of nowhere. The war ended and the 19th Amendment was passed, then girls everywhere started to get that post-war independent feeling. They wanted to do what they wanted, dress how they wanted, and they didn't care what people thought of them. Flappers were essentially women dealing with the depression of the war in the way of the times. So I set to work on my investigations. I talked to the bartender. Francis generally avoided the dance floor. He would sit at the bar and write music. He always loved to be surrounded with jazz, and speakeasies were definitely the place for that. I have absolutely no idea who killed him. He was a good man, but he didn't seem to have any problems. He may have been involved. It was about this time that one of the local dames rushed over to me. She grabbed my arm and without any word began to pull. This was an obvious invitation to dance. Of course I was on duty, but I could hardly resist a good swing dance. That's another one of those crazy inventions of the early 20s. The jazz music struck a chord in the heart of the flappers, and they naturally came up with the swing in response. It didn't go over too well with folks either. In fact, I remember some of the interviewees saying,
Them dang flappers just do whatever they want, it seems. They're Charlestoning and trotting all over the place. It's plain old devil worship.
Dance is just as bad. If you ask me, it's a moral downfall of society, with those shimmies and...
Public opinion aside, I felt strangely attracted to the dance. There's just something about that post-war independent feeling that's conveyed through simple dance. It's pretty funny, actually. It was while I was dancing that a thought hit me. I glanced over through the crowd to the mob boss's door. Some men friends stepped out and just kind of wandered away. They were obviously mobsters. Something the bartender said earlier only now struck me. He may have been involved in the mob. And that was all there was to it, it seemed. Francis was just another victim of the mob, wrapped up in unfortunate circumstances. It's a shame, too. He could have made an excellent contribution